Hi, my name is Ray Parker. I'm a bass player in New York City, originally from the Midwest. I've been playing bass professionally my whole life, starting back in the early 80s, right out of high school. And I've been in New York City for about 20 years now. I'm mainly a jazz player. I do a lot of different kind of stuff. I specialize in playing small group drummerless playing. So as a bass player, you know that's a very challenging thing to do. I'm here to share with you what I know. We're going to be talking about walking bass lines. What that really means in the simplest form is that you're playing one note per beat and you're connecting chords with your notes. As all with things that sound simple, it's a lot more complicated than that. I'll start off by saying the first thing you want to really consider yourself as you're walking bass is that you're really kind of a bass drum that makes pitches. So if you've heard the old recordings of St. Gene Krupa, drummers of that era, they played a real heavy 4-on-the-floor bass drum, sort of sound like this, and hooked up very closely with the bass player. Modern drumming, they don't do that, but that's still the effect that you want. So, so you're kind of a bass drum that makes notes, and the most important thing about what you're doing is feel. You have to make it feel good. That's really your main function. There are many higher levels you can get to, and we can talk about some of those. And so in order to get started here, the first thing I want to talk about is sound. Sound production is your most important thing. If you're getting a mushy sound, you're getting an indistinct sound, it doesn't matter what you play, nobody's going to hear it. They're not going to feel it. You're not going to get called back, unfortunately. And so with this, we're going to talk about the right hand. The sound can arguably be mainly made in the left hand, which gets into like bow playing and that sort of thing. But it does start with the right hand, and I'll show you some different ways of getting a good sound. You want a sound that where you stand on the bass, you have to make it sound kind of obnoxious, because a lot of the high end, a lot of what you hear that you don't like in the sound disappears in the first 5 or 10 feet. So when I play the bass, if you were to stand here next to me as a new bass player, you would think it was just the most horrendous, obnoxious, awful sound you've heard. But you have to remember you're filling a room with the sound. You're not playing for yourself. Now, in order to get this sound, there are a lot of different ways to do it. One thing, if you're this far into bass playing, if you pull up very high on the neck here, you know you get kind of a warm round sound, but it's also a little fuzzy, like that, a little indistinct. If you pull down here at the end of the fingerboard, you notice that it's very thin sounding, but it has a very strong attack. Okay, now that's only a generality. You can do a lot at both ends of this fingerboard, this part of the fingerboard. Ray Brown is the name I would like to bring up. If you really want to get a master class, Ray Brown is probably the best walking bass player ever to live, undeniably. Check him out, but the first thing I'm going to show you is the way he produces sound. He played down at this end of the fingerboard, but what he did is use quite a bit of flesh on the string in order to put warmth back into that thin sound, and he pulled quite hard. So if you were to walk a bass line, okay, so it's to my ear a drier sound. It still has good sustain and has a very strong attack, and this is a very, very effective sound. The way I like to play, I like a kind of a prettier sound, a rounder, warmer sound. So I back off up the fingerboard this way a little bit like that. But you'll hear if you're doing this, it's there's not much attack on the sound like that. So as soon as you get drums, you get piano, you get that sort of thing, your tone will disappear. So what you have to do, as opposed to here, instead of adding more flesh, you add a little more fingertip, then you can get a nice, again, punchy sound. All right, and then you have all variations in between as how to produce that sound. Okay, now I'd like to talk a little bit about the notes that you're going to be playing. I'm going to be using a song which is played at every jam session worldwide in every language. Let's quickly go through the changes. We have 2, 5, 1, 4 in B flat, 2, 5, 1 in the relative minor of G minor. So those chords are C minor 7 to F7, B flat major to E flat major, A minor 7 flat 5, D7 to a G minor. AA does that. On the bridge, it does a 2-5 to G minor again, 2-5 to B flat. It does another 2-5 to G minor, but when you get to this G minor, it's actually a 3 chord in the key of E flat, and he'll do a turnaround, often with these subs. And then the 4 chord actually turns into a substitute for the 2 chord of G minor to the 5 chord of G minor back to G minor. Okay, so sounded like a lot. That was just a dust over, just so we know what notes we're expected to play. Now, the first thing I would do, if you've never walked bass, you don't know the tune, maybe you're just learning the neck, is even without a metronome, just go through, learn how to play the roots of all the chords. Don't even worry about chord qualities yet. Just learn how to play these bridges. And so forth. So at least you know what chords you're playing. You need to be able to do that to start off with. The next step would be to play a root and fifth. And so forth through the whole song. And at this point, you know enough to really start constructing your walking bass line. Something I'm not going to dig so far into right now, but you should really be able to play a good 2 before you can play a good 4. I'll leave that to your own exploration, but let's do it in time now. So we'll put the metronome about right there. I am the metronome, I guess. And 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so once you can get through the song being able to do that, the next step now is to actually walk the bass line. Now we know enough notes, we know the shape of the form, it should be all in our head, so we're just worrying about feel. And to walk a bass line, we'll just go 1, 1, 5, 5, like this, 1, 2, 3, 4. So forth. And you're going to find if you're in a jazz big band in your school, they're going to hand you probably a Mel Bay chart, and the bass line is going to be almost exactly that. They'll be throwing in some thirds and maybe some other notes, but the bass lines generally are quite fundamental and simple like that. And get out your metronome, get out your real book, or whatever it is you want to work on, pick a tune and do it. And that should take you some time. Okay, now that we've talked about a bass line, a walking bass line, which is in 4/4 time, 1 note per beat, playing notes that outline the chords. The important thing about a bass line is that it feels good, and the best way to make it feel good is to first get a good sound and then put the note in the right spot. We've kind of covered that. We've gone through a tune, a well-known tune, and done a simple bass line based on just roots and fifths of each chord as it goes by. Now we're going to expand on that a little bit, because that'll get pretty dry pretty fast. Once you get the hang of that, you're going to be aching for more. And now we actually start following the path of music that any horn player, any piano player, any singer would have to learn to play melodically, because we're going to be constructing within these confines that we've already set up. We're going to be setting up counter melodies. So it's a melody that supports another melody, whether it be the soloist or the melody of the song or whatever it is. And to do that, we have to learn what our note choices are. That's the easiest way to figure it out, rather than try to haphazardly find things or find them completely by ear. There are ways of learning all this that are going to train your ear. And now we're into chord scales and chord theory. Not too complicated stuff. They're big words. It just means play the right note. So the chords that we're playing here are the roots. And then, so these are the chords that we're going to be working on. There's going to be a reference that you can read and so forth. The first thing we need to do is to be able to play each one of these chords. C minor 7th, F 7th, B flat major 7th, E flat major, A minor 7 flat 5, D7, G minor. Okay? You want to, and this is where I got to recommend that you can make up exercises to really know that you know what you think you know. Let's, for instance, I just played all the chords up. Let's play all the chords down. Alternate. And so forth. And run them back and forwards and make sure that you really know them. Because now I'm going to give you a little example of how you could use this, knowing what you know, to make your bass line a little juicier. Again. Right? I didn't do it on every chord to break it up, but now you have a bass line that sounds a little more interesting. With each one of these chords, you also have a mode of the major scale that's going to go along with that chord. So in the case of a C minor 7th in the key of B flat, you're going to play the B flat scale from C to C. It has a fancy Greek, Latin kind of name. If you want to know it, it's called Dorian. But what's important is that you know it. You don't need to know the names necessarily. So B flat scale from C to C, B flat scale from F to F, B flat scale, B flat scale from the 4th degree to the 4th degree. Now you can combine these chord scales and the chords in order to put a bass line together. So something like this. Right? Now our bass lines are getting to be a little bit more fun, more interesting. And you can see just from the three things the two things we've just added, your ability to construct crazy bass lines is almost too much to imagine. But through doing the exercises and so forth, you have enough to really start pumping things into your ear. Okay, so to quickly recap what we've done, we've talked about what a walking bass line is. We've talked about producing sound. We've talked about just playing the roots and the fifths of the chords that we're working on. And we've also talked about using the chords and the chord scale that goes with each one of those chords. Now, we get into chromatic playing. And there's a few different ways to organize these. One is actually more fundamental, and perhaps I should have discussed it earlier. But I like to bring it in now because that you have the chord scale in your head. That knowledge is something that's important. If you're walking chords that are going through the cycle in the direction of fourths, and you have one chord per measure, this is a very common situation. So for instance, C minor 7th for 4 beats, F 7th for 4 beats, a B flat major 7th for 4 beats. What you can do is from the root of the first chord, skip up a scale step, walk chromatically to the next chord. So now we've walked in a semi-chromatic fashion from the 2 chord to the 5 chord. We can do the same thing going from the 5 chord back to the 1 chord. Right? So now we have, you've heard that a million times if you've been listening to your records. So that's a chromatic way to go through. We're going to do it now going from high notes to low notes. So for instance, and you might say, hey, that's just a major scale. And it is exactly a major scale. C minor 7th, F 7th to B flat. Okay? If you have chords that are 2 beats apiece, for instance, rhythm changes is one that you may run into a lot. Every 50s tune in the world is written on that. There's a million bebop tunes written on this. Is a very common set of changes. You'll run into it at the end of sections of a tune. You'll run into it at the end of the tune. Something you do a lot, 2 chords per change. What you can do is use a chromatic note above each note to connect that, to connect to the next chord. So for instance, we're going B flat, G, C, and F. You can go B flat, A flat, G, D flat, C, G flat, F, B natural, B. Okay? So now I'm going to walk a 2-5-1 in B flat with a 1-6-2-5 at the end, landing at the 1 chord. It's a lot of numbers, just listen, you'll understand in a second. Okay, so these are some chromatic ways to get through a 2-5-1. Another thing you're going to run into commonly is if you have a major chord for 2 measures. Say we have 2 measures of B flat, or what you can do is drop to the 3rd. So you play the root, play the 3rd of the chord, walk chromatically to the 5th, skip a scale step, then continue back to the note where you started. So, or you can go part way up and bring the scale back down. Right? So here's a lot of fundamental ways that you can start adding chromaticism into your playing. And the last one I'm going to throw at you is a little more advanced, and this is getting into something called neighboring tones. In true mathematic fashion, for any note, you have 2 chromatic notes on either side that you really have access to. Which, if you've hung with any more advanced theory playing, they call this double chromatic approach. There's a lot of words. But the neighboring tones that I'd really like to focus on are much simpler than that. It's a subset, and this is a half step below a note and a scale step above that note, okay? Half step below, scale step above. So, and this gets more into like really melodic horn type playing, but it's stuff that's perfectly valid to use as a bass line. And so, as a first example, maybe a first exercise, we're going to take the C minor 7th, this is the first chord in the progression that we've been using, and do a neighboring tone around each chord of the scale, each note of the scale. So, around C, right? I guess I'll just kind of leave you with that as a little sampler, but I'll give you an example of me using everything that we've talked about so far to walk a bass line to the song that we've been talking about. I do have a profile at lessonface.com where you can get private lessons. I do give lessons there, and stop by, sign up.